Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the April TNPS online seminar. We have an interesting topic lined up tonight that I think you'll really enjoy. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to make a few brief announcements. We are encouraged by the strong participation in TNPS field trips this year. Uh, our speaker, Bart Jones, has done a good job in helping to plan that program again this year, and we've had good participation. So there are several additional outings that are planned for this spring and summer, and I recommend that you take a look at the list of those over on our website on the calendar page. It'll give you all the information and how to register for those. Um, Next, for the past couple of months, we've been sharing posts on our Facebook page highlighting native plants currently in bloom this spring. And if you are a Facebooker and you've enjoyed those, let us know in the comments so that we can continue to bring that sort of content to you. Um, just a note for the TNPS members, the registration for our annual conference will close on April 30th. So if you haven't registered and you're planning to go, we do encourage you to sign up soon so that we can finalize our attendance numbers for the conference. If you have any questions during tonight's presentation, please enter them in the chat, and we will set aside time at the end to address them. Also, kindly keep your microphones muted during the presentation to prevent any unintended distractions. So now I'd like to move on to our program. Our speaker tonight is Bart Jones, a dedicated member of TNPS for more than 20 years. He's played a key role in the organization's success, including overseeing the field trip program and leading numerous field trips across the state. Some of you may have had the opportunity to join him on those field trips. Bart has also served actively on the TNPS Board of Directors, contributing to the organization's ongoing operations, and is a past president. As a career scientist, Bart brings a distinctive combination of expertise and attention to detail to all of his endeavors. Please join me in welcoming Bart Jones.
All right, thank you, Mitchell. Before I start, I'm going to apologize if you hear noise. So if there's a plane or dogs barking or whatever, I'm just outside in my screen room, so it's a little bit more quiet than in the house. But anyway, that I will apologize if you hear anything. Just ignore it. And also, I want to get your attention to the screensaver here, the background. This is the impetus of why I joined TNPS. These orchids, the Cypripedium kentuckiense, they grow on my family's property in Decatur County. And we discovered those in the mid 70s before it was even described as a new species. And for a long time, I really wasn't sure what I had up there. Um, I started going to meetings at the Memphis Orchid Society, and finally they had a speaker about cypripediums, and lo and behold, he had a picture of exactly what I had seen. So I found out it was Cypripedium kentuckiense, and then not long after that, Dennis Horn was giving a talk at the Memphis Horticultural Society at the Botanic Garden here in Memphis, and he uh, was also kind of promoting our book that was going to come out in a few years if we could get it published. And so I became very interested in joining TNPS, and I think I joined right after that. And then the next year led a hike to see these orchids. So that's just kind of the backstory about why I'm in TNPS and why I have an affinity for our native orchids. And I will share my screen now. All right, so most people don't really even know that there are a lot of native orchids in Tennessee. Most people that might be familiar with the lady slippers, some people might know that they're orchids, but a lot of people just think that they're wildflowers, and they think that orchids belong in the tropics. But we have 50 different species of native orchids here in Tennessee. And some of these are really special and really beautiful. And I'd like to just kind of share a few thoughts about each of these species. So, to start with, though, let's just talk a little bit about what makes an orchid an orchid. Um, Orchids are distinguished from other flowering plants in that both of the sexual organs of the flower are on one structure. All other flowers have separate stamens and anthers for the males, and they have styles and pistils for the females. Sometimes those structures can be sort of united, like in a hibiscus flower, but it's more of an elongation of where they're joined. They're still an individual stamen, individual anthers, but they kind of look like a structure. But in orchids, it truly is one structure. And if you look at that bottom picture, you can get a view of the pollinia, which is a package of pollen that an orchid has. Orchids don't have pollen in grains, they're all in a package, and they usually have a sticky end so that it can be stuck to the pollinator. And then the pollinator will take it to another flower where it will attach to the sticky part of the stigma. And then you'll facilitate uh, pollination. In this particular example, this is Calopogon tuberosus, or the grass pink. The structure of the flowers, there's six different tepals. You have three sepals and two petals that are very similar usually, but in an orchid, there's another petal that has been modified called the lip or the labellum, and it can be extremely varied in shape and be very different from the other two petals. And its main function is to facilitate allure of a pollinator to the flower. So in this particular case, you can see that the lip has what looks to be like stamens and pollen. And so bees are attracted to that area. And then that lip has a hinge which will collapse once the bee lands on it. And the bee will then fall back onto the pollen, on the pollinia, where it will stick to its back. And then in the hubbub, it will fly off to another flower and do it all over again. And that's how they pollinate. So I'm going to talk tonight and kind of groups of orchids, either by their genus or if they have sort of a similar lifestyle or grow in a certain condition, because you kind of find them always together or in that same kind of habitat. So the first one I want to talk about are the saprophytic orchids. And a saprophyte isn't really an epiphyte like a lot of orchids that grow on a tree in the air. These grow in the ground, but they're not really gaining nutrients from the soil. What they're doing is they're gaining all their nutrients from organic material that's decaying, like leaves and stuff. So a lot of times you'll find these in deep forest and areas where the leaves collect and are breaking down. And so these orchids will grow there. And because they can gain all of the energy that they need and all the nutrients from that organic matter, they have no need for chlorophyll. So there are no leaves, there's no green parts. And most of these tend to be kind of a reddish brown or a purplish brown when they flower. And so the first group is the coral roots, and these are all coral roots basically, but there's one that's a different genus. But these are all Corallarhiza, which does mean coral root, literally. And so this was one of the rarer ones. It's a spotted coral root. It's only found in the Northeast mountains. One that's a lot more common is the fall coral root. Now, this particular picture shows open flowers, but for most of you who are out in the woods and really looking for orchids, you'll notice that you don't usually find it looking like this. And orchids have a tendency to produce what they call cleistogamous flowers, which are self-pollinating flowers. And this is what you'll usually see. So what happens is the flower is almost stunted and it doesn't really open because as it's forming, the pollen already pollinates and seeds are already starting to be produced as it sends up its flower stalk. So this is what you'll typically see when you find a fall coral root, not the prettier open flowers, but occasionally you will. And that happens on good years where the conditions have been perfect for them. And then this is their chance to make a sexual um, reproduction instead of asexual, because these are basically clones. And the most familiar, and it's widespread over the state. And I'll just mention that I lifted these maps from the UT Herbarium site when it was up. And so they're not totally accurate because these are all reflective of herbarium specimens that have been vouchered in various herbaria across the state. So it gives you a good idea of where they are, but you might see that your county is not colored in orange. That doesn't mean that it's not there. And it just hasn't been submitted to a herbarium, but it gives you an idea of where the coverage is. But this is the most common one, and you'll see it in the early spring. And as in most coral roots, they just come up as a flower stalk and bloom, and they may go dormant for several years afterwards while they gain more energy. And the reason that they get their name coral root is because if you would dig the roots up, it looks like a piece of bleached coral. They're jagged and branched, very thick rhizomes, and it does look just like coral. And then the other coral root, which isn't a member of the Corallorhiza genus, is Hexalectris spicata. And this likes to grow in limestone areas. So you'll see this around the Cedar Glades in Middle Tennessee and also in areas of limestone exposed near the mountains in East Tennessee. I have seen it in Decatur County in the Glades, even though it's not listed there. But this one's a much larger flower and a much more striking flower. And it's kind of a golden honey color with the petals and sepals, and then this really bright purple striped lip to draw in the pollinators. It's a really pretty plant. Then there are a couple of orchids that go dormant in the summer, and they have a very odd lifestyle in that they send up their leaves at the end of summer and the beginning of fall, and those leaves will persist through the winter. And what they're doing is they're taking advantage of no competition for the sunlight. Even though it's a weaker sunlight, there's no competition. So they're getting all of the sunlight that's coming through the forest. And what they'll do is they'll take all the sun in, get their energy, and then as the canopy of the leaves in the spring come out, they die back and go dormant. And then sometime during the early or late summer, they will send up their flower spike without any leaves showing at all. So you have to kind of mark where you see the leaves to then come back to find the flowers. And the first of those is putty root, another one that's fairly widespread throughout the state. Nice little yellowish flower with purple tips. But this is what you'll notice first are the leaves. And these leaves are kind of like they look kind of thick and leathery, and they have these white fibrous veins that are going through them. And if you turn them underneath, they're still green. Now, the other one that we have is the cranefly orchid. And it's the most common orchid in Tennessee, and it's also the most common orchid in the eastern United States. And also one of the few orchids that's actually increasing its population. Most orchids are kind of reducing population, having issues with habitat destruction. So the numbers are dwindling, but cranefly orchid is increasing as it seems to be able to pioneer and colonize some of the disturbed land. But the difference with it is if you turn the leaf over in the winter and look, it's purple. And one of the things that leaves do in any plant, if they have an underside that's purple, purple is like a almost like sunscreen for a plant. So you see plants that grow in full sun a lot of times will get a purplish tinge to the leaf. Well, what that purple is doing is reflecting the sunlight, the photons. And so the photon will come through the top where you can see the green and hit the chlorophyll, excite it, but then it'll hit this purple background at the bottom leaf and then bounce back up through the leaf again and hit more chlorophyll. So basically, the leaf is able to utilize the amount of energy and multiply it twice. So it can get more and more energy, even though winter sunlight is relatively weak. And that's how it can gain the energy to be able to reproduce every year. All right. Then there are also a set of orchids that are basically evergreen. And there are two species that we have in Tennessee, and we call them jewel orchids because in reality, the leaves are actually prettier than the flowers. And people will try to grow these just because of the leaf pattern. And you can see the faint background on these slides. That's one of these orchids, which is downy rattlesnake plantain or Goodyear pubescens. This one is by far the most common of the two species we have. I think the flowers are attractive, especially because when you have a spike like that and it's all white, it's actually very showy. Flowers are very small individually, but the collective is very showy. But this is what the leaves look like. And sometimes you can get a little bit of an iridescent sheen on that white. So that's where it gets its name jewel orchid. Uh, for downy rattlesnake plantain, the middle vein is very prominently pale striped, almost silvery. And then the minor veins go out and give it that venation, that netted look. The other species is a lot smaller, has much fewer flowers, and you can see the leaves there to the left. They don't have that center stripe of white, and it gives the overall effect of being almost checkerboarded. So the leaves are very attractive, but it's a much smaller plant, and it's also much less common and only found in the mountains. Then we have our first large genus. So we have a couple of genera in Tennessee that have quite a few species to them, and the first one is Spiranthes. And the name Spiranthes means coiled flower, and it perfectly describes the way that the flowers are arranged along the stem. And this is one of the most enigmatic genera that we have. People keep finding new species in this all the time, especially since the advent of DNA genetics and sequencing. We've been able to separate many more of these species out because they all look very, very similar, and it's almost impossible unless you're a complete expert and know exactly what to look for to be able to distinguish between some of them. And Dennis is very familiar with this. Dennis Horn is very familiar with this genera of this genus, and he's still doing a lot of research. And he's probably helped finding that some of our Middle Tennessee flowers are actually not what we thought they were. And so there's still controversy within this, still lots of scientific work done in this genus. So I'm going to talk about a few, but I'm going to go briefly through some of the others just because they all look very similar. So the first one is Spiranthes cernua, or the nodding lady's tresses. And this is the one that has been basically a big collective of a lot of different species. And so people are slowly pulling things out of this species and splitting them into another species. And I don't know at the end of the day what a Cernua is actually going to be. There may not actually be a Spiranthes cernua at the end of the day. It may get completely split apart. But right now, it's basically any of these flowers that have a tendency to nod forward and downward, and also have the lateral sepals lie flat against the dorsal sepal and petals. So it kind of makes a hood over the lip, which usually flares out in kind of an open mouth. They typically have just a tinge of yellow, but not super yellow, mainly just crystalline white flowers. And you can get a good idea of in the lip how, if in the sunlight, the edges of that lip will just glisten like a crystal. One of the ones that was split out is Yellow Lady's tresses. It's not very common in Tennessee, but it's the only one that has an overall yellowish look to the flower. Even the sepals and petals will have a little bit of a yellowish look. Another one that's very, very similar is Fragrant Lady's tresses. Uh, Spiranthes cernua does not have a fragrance. It doesn't, and this odorata, Spiranthes odorata, does. It also grows in more of a colony than does the cernua. And they like to be in, both of them like to be in very, very wet, damp environments. So they're very similar looking and grow in very similar habitat. I don't know exactly how common odorata is in Tennessee because it probably has gotten confused with what was cernua for most people. So it could be underreported. This is my state record plant that I found in Decatur County. It's also been found in Franklin County now. This is the Great Plains Lady's Tresses, Spiranthes magnacamporum. It was also split away from Cernua. But if you notice the lateral sepals, the two that are coming out from the side, like right here, they stick up over the dorsal sepal. And that's one of the key characteristics. Plus, the lip has a lot more of a yellowish color to it. But one of the main things is, especially early in the, well, like 10 o'clock to 11 o'clock in the morning, they start to really have a very strong fragrance. And it almost has like an almondy marzipan type fragrance. It's a really nice smell. So that's another reason that it was separated out. Another really common one is the slender lady's tresses, and it can be separated because it's one of the few that has a really distinct color in the lip, and it's green. Another one with a really distinct lip is the shining lady's tresses with its yellow lip. This one's fairly rare, and it blooms pretty early in the year, and it almost always is found along the edges of creeks. It likes really damp environments. And one of the ones that is very restricted to the actual woodlands, it doesn't grow in the open at all, is oval lady's tresses. And it kind of gets its name because as the flowers open, the whole flower head kind of has an oval shape. They're very small flowers, but you can see that they're also very closely related to the cernua. Another really common one, especially in real dry habitat. So these like to grow in dry gully areas or kind of red clay areas, is little lady's tresses. And it's a much smaller plant than the other ones. It only gets about 6 to 8 inches tall typically. The flowers are very small and they're pure snow white. Spring lady's tresses, as the name would imply, is an early bloomer, but in the orchid world, and at least in Spiranthes world, early doesn't mean like April. It means like maybe the end of May, beginning of June. But you can also find these blooming all the way through August. So it's not exactly the spring lady's tresses. And then the one that almost everybody is familiar with and everybody loves, and they're the most showy orchids that we have, are the lady slippers. And there are 5 species of lady slippers that are found in Tennessee. One of the most common one that people are used to. It used to be really abundant on the Cumberland Plateau, but over the years, logging and other disturbances have hurt the populations. Plus, it's also been all these lady slippers are commercially exploited, and a lot of people go and dig them up from the wild. The thing about a pink lady slipper is it requires a very acidic soil, which most places don't have. And so it can't grow in a lot of places because of that. Plus, all orchids are reliant on fungal, a partner, a mycorrhizal fungal partner that helps them germinate and start to gather nutrients as seedlings. So that partnership needs to be in place also. And so it's very, very hard to try to transplant these. So we really, truly discourage anybody from trying to transplant a native orchid. They usually don't make it. And then this is the Kentucky lady slipper or Southern lady slipper. And this is the one that's on our farm. These were taken at our farm. Uh, they're a relatively rare orchid. Um, They're widespread. They go from Virginia to Texas, but there are never like large areas where they can be found. They're usually very small colonies and very isolated. So in Tennessee, there are three known locations for this. Scott County has probably the largest population, and then the Decatur County population is around 75 to 100 plants. And then there's a few down around Arnold Engineering. The small lady slippers, Cypripedium parviflorum. The name of these kind of go back and forth between pubescens and parviflorum and different subspecies, but for our talk, we're going to talk about it as a different species. These only occur in the mountains and some of the higher places along the Cumberland Plateau. Um, they're a much smaller flower and typically have really dark sepals and petals and that bright chrome yellow lip, but it's very similar to the one that we're used to from the mountains. It's very bright yellow also, but typically doesn't have the dark sepals and petals, and it's a much larger flower compared to the small one. It's found in Middle Tennessee also in places, and there's actually a few in West Tennessee if you can find them. And then the queen, Cypripedium reginae, the showy lady slipper. In Tennessee, we're at the very southern end of the range, so it's only found in a couple of places in the mountainous areas. But this is a fairly common orchid in the north and northeast, and it's the only orchid that is a state flower, and it's the state flower of Minnesota. The pink on the lip can be a very light blush, or the lip can be almost very deep pink. And that coloration is dependent on the temperature during the winter and the spring as it's growing. So if you go further north where springs are cooler, then you're going to have more intense pink on the lip. Ours are usually just a blush of pink because it's usually warmer in the spring here. Then our other genus that has quite a few species is the genus Platanthera, or these are the fringed or the rain orchids. Uh, these are almost all pollinated by butterflies or moths. And because of being pollinated by butterflies, they have very bright colors. Or if they're pollinated by moths, they're white and have a very strong fragrance that comes out in the night. Most Probably the most common and the most recognizable of these fringed orchids is the yellow fringed orchid. Even though it says it's yellow, it's really more orange. And most people that see it would say it's orange and not yellow, but that's how it got its name. But Platanthera ciliaris. They're very common on the Cumberland Plateau. They do like more acidic soils, but you can see how it gets its name with that labellum being very finely divided into hairs, almost hair-like appendages. The yellow crested orchid is a very similar orchid, except it's much smaller. Uh, Very rarely gets above a foot and a half, and the flowers are about a third the size of the yellow fringed orchid. And it's restricted to the Cumberland Plateau and usually in boggy areas. I say it's restricted to the Cumberland Plateau, but I do know that there is a population at Big Hill Pond State Park in Hardeman County here in West Tennessee. This is one of the rarest orchids, and for several years we thought it had been extirpated from Tennessee. It was found in some power line cuts near Arnold Engineering and in that area of the Cumberland Plateau. Um, this is the yellow fringeless orchid, but not too many years ago, they found several more plants that just kind of popped back up once some land was cleared out. So these are still around, but they probably really need to have some serious management done to them for them to be able to survive long term. But it's always been a relatively rare orchid, and I think it's because it is mainly restricted to prairie type environments. And so that would be one of the reasons it's in this area around May Prairie. Another really common one that's found in damp woodland areas, sometimes along seeps in woods, you'll find this woodland orchid. Has very small little greenish white flowers. They have these long spurs where the nectar is. And so this is where the butterflies and the moths are being attracted to this nectar reward in the spurs. And these flowers are almost always askew. They always look disheveled, like, what's wrong with this plant? It's all crooked. But that's kind of how the flowers tend to always be. And this is also one of our most famous orchids in Tennessee. This was on the endangered species list. It's pretty much restricted to the Cumberland Plateau and area over in Polk County called Star Mountain. But there can be hundreds of these plants when you find good habitat. But it likes boggy areas, and once you get outside of Tennessee, it becomes a very, very rare plant. It's mainly centered in Tennessee. The monkey face orchid, I think they call it an integral lip orchid now. They don't like monkey face, but that's how I learned it. But you can see that long nectar spur, and you can see the yellowish, looks like fangs coming out from the front. That's where the pollinia are. You can see the opening in the middle of the flower there, the little light area. Let's see, I get my cursor there. You can see that light area. That's the opening to the nectar spur. So the moths are going to come in here at night and they're going to push their head in. And the end of these fangs here are very sticky and they're going to stick to the side of the moth head. And then the moth is going to go to another flower and then it's going to go and push the pollen up into this area where the stigma is, and it's going to stick to that, and that's how it pollinates. But because this spur is so long and the nectar is only down in this area, it has to get its head all the way in to be able to get to the bottom where the nectar is. Kind of forces its way to being pollinated. Uh, this is an oddball orchid, Platanthera nivea, the snowy orchid. This is a coastal plain plant which is about 200 or 300 miles disjunct in May Prairie. It's the only place in Tennessee where it's found, and it's usually along the Gulf Coast. In May Prairie, there's several of these plants, and they're absolutely gorgeous when they bloom. It's recently been taken out of the genus Platanthera and put in I can't remember the name, Gymniopsidosi or something. I can't remember exactly, but for our talk, it's going to be Platanthera. But the reason it's taken out is because the lip is upside down, and all the other Platantheras, the lip is hanging down. This sticks up, so that's the difference. Then we have these purple ones that are absolutely incredible. And the large purple fringed orchid is extremely rare here in Tennessee. It has a very large flower, about an inch to inch and a half across. But if you notice, the opening here is just a round opening circle. And the more common one that people that have seen at around Klingman's Dome, there at the tower along that road, there's the small purple fringed orchid. A little bit smaller flower, a little bit smaller plant, still restricted to the mountains. But if you can look in here, it has like a dumbbell shaped opening. So that's an opening here, an opening here. And that's kind of how you can tell it just by looking at a picture from the flowers if you don't see it in person. But that's the main characteristic that's different. And then for those of us in West Tennessee, we have one too, but it doesn't have as much fringe. It's just kind of serrated along the edges, but it's the fringeless, purple fringeless orchid, Platanthera paramina. And but it's just every bit as beautiful. And I've seen these in like ditches that have a lot of water that stays in them, and they'll be blooming along the side of the road, and you can't miss them. I mean, they're very, very showy. And one that's a little bit less conspicuous, but still a very beautiful flower when you look at it up close because it's so finely divided into these fringed lobes of the lip. But Patanthera lacera, and it likes to also grow in kind of wet meadows. You can find this at Arnold Engineering and in some of the areas around there, and then in other wet areas along throughout the state. Another one that's pretty much restricted to West Tennessee. There's a few counties over in Middle Tennessee, but it's kind of what we consider a West Tennessee orchid is the southern tubercled orchid, Platanthera flava. It likes to grow in these really, really wet, boggy woodlands and bottoms here along rivers and swamps. So you almost will have to get muddy to be able to see it. But has very small flowers, but a relatively tightly bunched spike of flowers, and it's about a foot tall. So it's showy enough when you get up to it. And then lastly, in a couple of counties over in northeast Tennessee, mainly around Roan Mountain, you've got the padleaf rain orchid. Uh, it grows in the woods, and you can tell that it needs to have a lot of a large leaf to be able to gather the light in. So you can see these big round leaves, and that's where it gets its name, both padleaf and orbiculata, which means rounded. And then there are several other orchids that really only have one or two species or don't have any kind of special quality that puts them in one of these groups, but some of them are still very beautiful and showy orchids that need to be talked about. And of course, the first one is also the grass pink that we had earlier, Calopogon tuberosus. This loves kind of damp meadows and boggy areas. And this is Oklahoma grass pink, which is probably not extant in the state anymore, but there are some vouchered specimens in herbaria that come from May Prairie and from Van Buren County. And because they grow in the same kind of location and habitat that the tuberosus would be growing in, you could easily see how they would be missed. But the main point is in tuberosus, the top of this lip here is a little concave, whereas in oklahomensis, it's pointed. That's one of the main characteristics to tell the difference. So if you're out in a place where there are a lot of grass pinks, just take a look and make sure you don't have an Oklahoma grass pink growing along with them. That'd be a great find. This is one I've never seen. It's a very nondescript little green orchid. It only grows up in the very far northeastern mountains. The long-bracted frog orchid. Another relatively showy orchid. I'm sorry, guys. I'm beginning to lose my voice here. Uh, Found in the Cumberland Plateau and in the eastern mountains where you have some boggy areas. I've seen this growing at Arnold Engineering, the same place that the calopogons are growing. But this is Clystes bifaria, the spreading pogonia. And pogonia is an old term that applied to a lot of orchids. It was like a generic term for a wild orchid. So you will see a lot of common names for orchids that include the word pogonia. But this one's kind of cool in that it forms a tube here over the lip. And what that does, you can see these little pink lines inside the lip. They're drawing bees into that area, thinking there's going to be a nectar reward back here, but there really isn't. But they go searching, and then back here's where the pollen will be. So it kind of forms a tube to guide the bee in, and then he gives up and comes back out, but probably has pollen on him at that point. And then the small world pogonia is probably the rarest orchid in the eastern United States. Um, they've been found in Hamilton County at one point. I don't know if anybody knows that there's an actual population extant now. And a thing that's very difficult about determining whether there still is a population existing is because these orchids can go dormant for years. Now, I'm talking like 20, 25 years. If the conditions are not just perfect, these things will just lay dormant as a tuber under the ground or a rhizome. But when conditions are right, they can come up and then you'll find them. So a lot of people think they're disappearing, but is it actually disappearing or are they just going dormant in that location? So it's a really difficult orchid to get a handle on. They're probably very rare anyway, but they're even more rare to see because of that. But one that isn't rare to see is the large world pogonia. So it has a much larger flower with these really long thread-like sepals. I think it's a really attractive orchid. I love this orchid. These are pretty common on the Cumberland Plateau and areas, even in the mountains. So you can see these pretty frequently, especially you'll see the whirl of leaves, which can be confused with Indian cucumber root. But when an Indian cucumber root blooms, it has another stack of little leaves at the top. Lily leaf twayblade. Twayblade is another common name for several different kinds of orchids. It just means two leaves. But this is one that's pollinated by flies, and you can tell that it has this fleshy look in its flower, and that will attract the flies. It probably also has a very foul fragrance. It may not be very strong. I've never smelled it, but that color of flower tends to be pollinated by flies. Another relatively rare orchid in Tennessee is Lessel's twayblade. It likes to grow in kind of these gravelly fens. So sometimes you'll find these when you find large colonies of Grassa parnassus. You can look for these, and they might be hidden amongst some of those areas. I think this is one of the orchids that is rapidly declining, though. So it's one of these special concern and threatened species. But the southern tway blade, on the other hand, is increasing. And this is probably due to environmental warming. They're only found in a couple of counties as of the uh, herbarium website listing. But I know other people now have told me they found them in a few other counties along the southern border of Tennessee. So they seem to be moving up into the southern parts of Tennessee. These are really tiny orchids, and they're the earliest blooming orchid that we have. This is usually blooming by the middle of March to the end of March. Um, there's two different color forms of the flower. This is the darker red form. It's also mimicking meat, flesh. It's pollinated by flies and mosquitoes. And there's another color form that's more of a bronzy green color. And you can see them both at the same place. So I don't know if it's genetics or if it's environmental. Probably a little bit of both. But be on the lookout if you live in the southern tier of the state because these are moving into your area. They do like low, flat, um, like flat lands, flat woods where it stays pretty damp through the winter. And then they like to grow in areas that have ephemeral ponds in the woods also. So they're kind of tied to wetlands areas, kind of. The other Listera tway blade that we have is smallest tway blade, only found in the mountains. And I think this is pretty uncommon also. Then you have the green adder's mouth. Um, it gets its name because of the leaf. And you're probably familiar with adder's mouth fern. When these are not in flower, the vegetative plant looks a lot like adder's mouth fern or adder's fern, Ophioglossum. But the flowers kind of mimic sphagnum. And I have seen these growing in sphagnum bogs, and they're almost invisible. The flowers are almost invisible amongst the sphagnum. But this has the smallest flower of any of our native orchids. It's about an eighth of an inch across. Uh, and you'll find the tuberosus, the grass pink, the calopogon tuberosus. You'll probably also find rose begonia. They tend to grow together in these wet meadows. It's a really beautiful little flower, a little bit smaller flower than the calopogons, but still just as pretty. This kind of raggedy fringed lip is really attractive. And it's also bringing in the pollinators. One that people are very familiar with from the mountains, when you drive along through the mountains, you'll see large patches of this showy orchis growing alongside the road, along the trails. It's just everywhere. It's a beautiful two-tone flower, the dark pinkish purple hood and petals, then the stark white spade-shaped lip. Um, these do have a fragrance. but it's a very short time frame. I've smelled these like in the early morning when the sun first hits them. It's a real spicy fragrance, but then by noontime it's gone. So I'm not sure what it's keying on for a pollinator, but it must be something that comes out early in the morning and then kind of hides in the heat of the day. Another rare orchid that we don't have many colonies of in Tennessee is the shadow witch, um, Ponthieva racemosa. These are more of a tropical genus of orchids, but there is this species in the southern United States. It likes to grow in these deep ravines and it blooms late in the summer, early fall. So, another reason that people don't see this orchid a lot is just because of the timing of the year. Most people aren't out in the woods in the late summer and early fall when it's hot and buggy and spider webs everywhere. And the last of our orchids that we'll talk about is the three birds orchid. It gets its name because oftentimes there will be three flowers open at once, and they look like they're birds with their mouths held up open, waiting for mom to feed them. That's where they get their name. It's a little bit of an oddball orchid also in the fact that it's semi-saprophytic. It does have leaves and it makes, has chlorophyll, so it does gain energy that way. But it also does the same thing as a coral root does and gets energy from decaying matter in the leaf litter. So I find these here in Shelby County in Meeman Shelby Forest down in the bottoms of these ravines at the base where the leaves kind of all collect and make this real thick duff. They're in there usually. And so another odd thing about these is they will grow up quickly, form these buds like this one here, and then they just kind of go into stasis during the heat of the summer because these tend to bloom in the end of July, beginning of August. So what happens is you will have a cold front come through and it'll rain and it'll drop the temperature a few degrees and that will activate these buds and it activates all the buds. And so what happens is the entire colony in that area will bloom all at once, and these flowers will open all on the same day. And that just helps ensure that the pollinators can get to all these flowers and pollinate them instead of just one here, one there. They're all open at the same time. So it's a little tricky to find them in bloom, but if you can sort of, okay, it rained and it got cooler, I'm going to go in 2 or 3 days and see if I can't find these. And a lot of times, if you know that the plants are there, you'll be able to find them in flower. And I would also like to take some time to give a shout out to these people who I stole some of the pictures from. Most of these were taken from the UT Herbarium website, but they were taken by these people. Some of these are not with us anymore, but I still appreciate the fact that they were able to take some beautiful photos and were gracious enough to be able to put them into the public domain. And with that, I am done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bart. An excellent presentation and great information for those of us who are always on the lookout for orchids out there. We do have a number of questions here in the chat, so I'll go down the list here. Terry asked, when does the snowy orchid bloom at May Prairie?
I believe it's in July, early July. Dennis might have a better time for that.
See, I mean, historically, like 40 years ago, I always figured it was the first week of August, but now it's probably, I would say, peaks probably close to the 10th of July by now. I would look for it July 10th to the 15th.
Yeah, I think I took my picture when I went there that time. It was probably the middle of July.
Very good. Good information. So I'm going to move on to Rose's question, which was, when does the purple fringillus orchid bloom?
Okay, those tend to be in late July or early August. Usually the last 2 weeks of July is a good time to go for those. A lot of the platantheras are like late summer bloomers.
And Gail asked, where in Hamilton County were Thigla seen? I think there was one of the orchids that was only shown in Hamilton County, and
Yeah,
that's
that would be the small world Pagonia, and I have absolutely no clue where
probably
that would be.
okay.
Um, More than likely, that's an old herbarium specimen that someone collected. Dennis, do you know of anybody that's seen that orchid recently in Tennessee?
No, I have seen that orchid, and I mean, this was back when Bus Jones was still living, so that's been over 30 years ago. I don't know whether it's still there. It was on the Cumberland Plateau, but I don't know if it still exists there or not. I don't think anybody's seen it in the last 20 years.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard anybody that's seen it actually blooming in Tennessee recently.
So Robin says beautiful photos. I think we'll all agree with that. Sherry says thanks for the presentation. Enjoyed it. Deb has a question. What do latest trusses leaves look like?
Okay, that's a good question because the leaves are actually very important when you're trying to identify your lady's tresses. They're usually kind of long and narrow and almost grass-like. So they kind of get hidden in the grasses if they're growing around grasses. But a lot of the ladies' tresses, the leaves will die down as the flower spike goes up. So when the flowers are actually blooming, there are no leaves present. That's a characteristic. Then there are other ones when they bloom, they still do have their leaves, basal leaves that are still green. And that's another way you can characterize one species versus the other. They're like that the one that had the green lip, the slender lady's tresses. Uh, that one has more of a spade-shaped leaf. It's a little bit wider and not so long, and they lay flat on the ground in a rosette during the winter. But then they die away as the flower blooms. A lot of times you can find sporanthes just by the leaves in the wintertime because they'll kind of overwinter as leaves sometimes. So I know that I used to see them in my parents' yard during the winter, and I could say, there's orchids here. And then I would tell my dad not to mow them and let them bloom. And then they would bloom, and he would tell me, well, your orchid bloomed. And I go, it did. He goes, yeah. He goes, yeah, it looks like a weed to me.
Good.
Typical. Yeah. Okay.
So
That's funny. Yeah.
Robin asked, are there any of these orchids easily able to be grown from seed in your experience?
Uh, okay. Orchids are almost impossible to grow from seed. You have to have basically a specialized laboratory because orchids are one of the few plants that their seed have no endosperm. So they have no food source. So, like when you plant a pea and it comes up, you see those two thick, like the first leaves that look like leaves, but they're not really leaves. That's the food source that the seed had to start to germinate and grow. Orchids don't have that. They're only an embryo and they have to be infected with a mycorrhizal fungus almost immediately. And then that fungus will provide the nutrients for the embryo to be able to grow and germinate. So orchids are very difficult to grow from seed, even in a laboratory setting where you can provide all these nutrients for it. That's how most people do grow orchids in labs. And there are labs that do grow some of the native orchids from seed, and you can buy them as adult plants. And you're going to probably spend 75 to $200 per plant because of that. It takes about 7 years before that seedling is old enough to bloom. So you're going to pay for that. And if you see things that are listed for cheaper than that, they've been dug out of the wild and they probably won't survive because of that. For whatever reason, when you grow an orchid up without its fungus in a lab setting, you can transplant that and it will grow better in a garden than one that would be transplanted. Even though it might still have the fungus associated with the roots, that fungus will not be able to survive. And because it's so intertwined with that particular plant, it's just not able to survive on its own. But there are places you can buy, especially lady slippers, but you're going to pay a lot of money for them.
Very good. So Rose has the question, what hike may we see orchids best to start out?
A hike.
Yes.
The thing about our hikes is I would say well over half of our hikes, we encounter an orchid.
Yes.
So just come to any of our hikes and you'll probably find an orchid. It may not be in bloom at the time, but we almost always point them out because orchids are kind of special. And so we always are pointing out, here's our orchid. It may just be a leaf or a rosette of leaves, or it may be the plant. And then we do have hikes that we specifically go to see an orchid. I know we had a hike last year where we went to see several of the platantheras in bloom because they tend to bloom at the same time. So just be on the lookout, but almost all of our hikes, you'll encounter an orchid.
Are there any other questions that people might have? We have a small amount of time here, so feel free to unmute your volume and ask your question. If not, let's say we have one. Are orchids only found in untouched areas? Are they unlikely to appear near an urban area?
No, that's a big myth. Actually, the majority of orchids are what we call pioneer plants. They like disturbance and they come into areas that have been disturbed.
Mm-hmm.
So, like Spiranthes in particular, you can find them in a yard. If you don't herbicide treat it, you will find orchids sometimes in your yards. At the Memphis Botanic Garden, underneath some magnolias, we found Spiranthes vernalis one year. So these things can pop up everywhere. Yes, some of the ones like the lady slippers tend to be in areas that are a little bit more pristine and old growth forests, but even the lady slippers sometimes appreciate to have some disturbance to the canopy and allowing a little bit more light to come in. But no, you can find orchids in almost any habitat in Tennessee, even in the city.
Very good. We had a question, when is the next seminar? Our seminars are held on the third Tuesday night of the month, and that's somewhere in the May 19 time frame. Check me on that date, but it's the third Tuesday night of the month each month. Dennis mentioned that seeing a world begonia on the plateau before someone died. What was that name?
Bus Jones was the one that originated the AFBs. It was called the American Society of I can't remember the exact title, but it was a Chattanooga wildflower group, and he and two other couples started this around 1983, and that organization got going and went for about 10 years. Bus passed away in 1992, so it was about 9 years after they founded the organization, and it no longer exists. But it was originated in Chattanooga, and I can't remember what the AFB stood for. I mean, what that.
I think wasn't it the Association of Southern Botanists?
I think you're right. The American Association of Southern Botanists, AFB, FBEE. Anyway, Chuck Wilson took it over for a while. He lives there in Chattanooga. He took it over for a while, but eventually it just faded out and no longer exists.
Chuck Wilson led a hike for us last year to see
Yes, he did.
orchids, and it was excellent. It was an excellent hike. Another question, has anyone written a book about Tennessee orchids? Will you, Bart?
I don't know about that. Not right now. No, as far as I know, there's not been a book specifically for Tennessee orchids. John Tullock, I think, lives in Knoxville. he wrote a book about growing hardy orchids, and it has a lot of information about some of the native orchids. But as far as anything that covers everything about, excuse me, Tennessee orchids, I'm not sure. I don't believe there is.
Well, our
He has
TNP,
just posted a link here that talks about native orchids of the southern Appalachian Mountains. So
Yeah.
we'll try to get that link out to folks after this.
Yeah, there are some regional books like that, but as far as a specific state one, I don't know of one.
And Kim Sadler remarked that we find them around Cedar Glades as well.
Oh yeah, they're everywhere.
That's good.
Actually, Dennis Esperanthes that he's been studying for years is tied to the Cedar Glades.
and I was going to say too that our Tennessee wildflower book uh, has like maybe 42 of the 50 covered in that book, so it pretty well covers the
Yeah.
orchids rather well.
Good point. Any final questions? Well, I want to thank Bart for giving us a great presentation tonight, and I want to thank all of you for participating, and we hope to see you again next month.
Bart, one little question.
Uh-huh.
Maybe you should do something like what Kim did, pull the orchids out of our book or augment what's there in our wildflower book and make a smaller handheld version of just the orchids.
Well, I could do that, especially in maybe 4 years once I'm retired.
Now you've got a plan.
Now I got a project to look forward to.
There you go.
There you go.
Okay, well, thanks again, everyone. Great seminar tonight, and we hope to see you again on the next one next month.